All right, caller, you're live on the air. Please tell us your name, where you're calling from.
Hey, good morning or good afternoon, good evening. This is Rudy from Barhead, Alberta.
Hey, Rudy. Welcome
Again.
back. Welcome back.
Hey, I have a question, and I hope that it's not too convoluted. So, my finite mind doesn't comprehend this, but maybe Rabbi can explain this. Was it always in God's mind to introduce death into humankind? And I'll explain that question. God told Adam and Eve to be fruitful and multiply, and they were created eternal beings right from the beginning, that they were immortals. However, we see that in China, for instance, and India, it's overpopulated really quick. The resources are very low. The water, some of the most contaminated rivers are in India and China. Not to mention the waste of garbage and human waste, both. So I'm thinking God didn't have to make, He didn't have to make the tree of good and evil, because they were, or the good of the tree of life, because they were already eternal beings. So He created the tree of good and evil in order to introduce death into the world. So the world can only sustain so many lives, so many human beings at the time. And over the generations, it wouldn't take in much eternal beings to overpopulate the whole world. And that's part of the question. The second part is, what's going to happen in the Messianic era, when millions of people are resurrected to physical bodies and Mashiach is here? Will the world sustain that many people? You know what I'm saying?
So if let me try to see if I can understand it as well. So if God, why would God put the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil together if all He intended on was eternal life?
Yeah, if man was already an eternal being, what's the purpose of the tree of good and evil? If they were perfect, in a world that was going to be perfect, that were going to fill the earth and in perfection, like, what was the purpose of that?
Okay, so
Of the tree of
just forgive me, because I kind of feel like I'm following you down one trail and then you turn down a different path. And it's not you, it might be me. I'm not sure. You're just asking me, then you're not asking about the tree of life at all. You're asking about the tree of knowledge of good and evil?
Right. Why would God introduce death into the world when everything was perfect? You know what I'm saying?
Okay. Let me ask you a question. Prior to the sin in the Garden of Eden, did Adam and Eve know the difference between good and evil in any way?
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
Yeah, prior to the sin prior to Adam and Eve eating from the tree of knowledge, did they know the difference between right and wrong? In your view, did they know the difference between right and wrong?
I would think they were perfect.
The fact that you're taking so long means that this is a very pressing question, right?
Right.
I mean, prior to the sin, let me ask you another question, Rudy. Would you want to be friends with somebody who did not know the difference between right and wrong? Would you want to have someone like that for a friend, or to marry a member of your family?
I would say no.
You would say no. We have words for that. They're called sociopaths. So in order to understand the answer to that question, you have to understand what was wrong with man knowing the difference between good and evil. I would think that would be something really good. And if man did not know the difference between good and evil, does that mean he didn't know the difference between right and wrong? And if he really didn't know the difference between right and wrong, then why was he punished if he didn't know anything? And why is it desirable that man doesn't know the difference between good and evil? These are fundamental questions that, if they're not answered, you can't even move ahead. As it turns out, Adam knew the difference between right and wrong, but that somehow right and wrong is not the same as good and evil. Now, we're not going to be able to do that in this show because the time doesn't permit it, but Adam and Eve knew what right was and wrong was, but right and wrong is not the same as good and evil.
I see.
To Adam and Eve, prior to the sin, there was just a world of truth and false. And what was wrong was interchangeable with false, and what was right was interchangeable with true. But something changed along the way. You must ask yourself the question, what was the motive of the serpent? Now, I know the serpent is thought of as the evil inclination, but the serpent's a very real creature in Tanakh, and we're introduced to him in the beginning of Genesis chapter 3. Why did the serpent seek to seduce Eve, and what argument was he making on why Eve should disobey God? What bothered him? And the argument he was making just doesn't seem to be coherent. We need to answer that question. What argument was the serpent saying to Eve? What argument was he making with her why she should? I mean, she was saying that God said you should not eat from the tree in the midst of the garden, neither shall touch it, lest you'll die. That's Genesis chapter 3, verse 3.
Right.
Okay?
Yeah.
But what the serpent says, the serpent says that you could eat it. What does that mean? Like, what is the serpent even talking about? What is the serpent's argument? And you've got to unpack all these things. I'll just very briefly hand you an answer, which is not going to go far enough to explain this. For humans, the way we know right and wrong, the way prior to the sin in the Garden of Eden, was whatever God said, that was true. And whatever disobeyed God's command was wrong. Right, was wrong. Was untrue. They were interchangeable. The serpent is a very striking creature because it could walk, talk. It was so intelligent that the Torah points out that it was the most intelligent of all creatures.
Right.
And we can see from the punishment, we can infer that it had it enjoyed good food, cuisine, because that was the punishment to the serpent, that it would not enjoy the taste of food. So we have a walking, talking creature that's highly intelligent and enjoys good cuisine. It sounds quite human-like. It's almost hard to distinguish between what is man and what defines an animal. It's so close. Whatever that serpent is, it's so close to human that it's hard to put your finger on why it's not human. That's what's coming across. The serpent's argument is that why are you taking your cues from what God said? Look at the words carefully. The way animals make decisions is based on our feeling, what feels good, what looks delicious, what looks tasty. Animals make decisions based on an impulse, an impulse that's built into the system. They see something they want and they go after it because they want it. So if you want it, that means it's right. Now that's how an animal behaves. When we say to people, you're behaving like an animal, we rarely mean that as a compliment, but rather we're saying that you're acting without thinking about the consequences or without thinking about what does God want you, how does God want you to behave. So that's what's going on here. It's a war between the human world and the animal world. And the serpent is calling on Eve to cross over. The only thing that distinguishes that creature, the serpent, from man, from Adam, is that Adam can hear the voice of God. And that should convey to you how to behave. What is being urged by the serpent is abandon the voice of God instead of go after what feels good, what tastes good, and what God says is not relevant. And in fact, as it turns out, no animal believes in God. Only human being does, because we're created in the image of God. This can't solve it, but we ran out of time. But this begins to convey to you what riddles about one of the most familiar events in the Torah have to be answered in order to begin to address the question of what is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? What new information did they acquire? They must have known the difference between right and wrong, and how is right and wrong different from good and evil? Right. What I've shared with you is not from my own, but it's Maimonides' Moreh Nevuchim, the Guide to Perplex, discusses this in greater depth. So as it turns out, prior to this, the sin that was committed by Adam and Eve, man was immortal. And death entered the world. Man became mortal when he ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. We could see that and infer that from Genesis chapter 2, verse 9. We are introduced to two trees in the Garden of Eden. Ve'etz hachayim b'soich hagan, and the tree of life was in the middle of the garden. Ve'etz hadas toivaro, and there was another tree, the location is not given, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Subsequently, we're told, Adam is told in Genesis 2, but now verse 17, just 8 verses later, Adam is told, Ume'etz hadas toivara loisechel mimenu, and of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, you may not eat from it, ki biyoim achalcha mimenu mois tamus, for the day that you eat from it, you will surely die, which means that you will be able to die. What happened to the tree of life? That means there's no prohibition in Genesis chapter 2 that which would forbid man from eating from the tree of life. Why not? Because at that stage, man was set to live without death in the world, and therefore eating from the tree of life would have been completely redundant. It only becomes important that man doesn't eat from the tree of life after the sin, and that you'll find in Genesis chapter 3, verse 22. So from here we can see clearly that prior to the sin that was committed in the Garden of Eden, man was set to live without death, immortal, and the world will return back to that state. That's very clear from the text. It's an inference, but it's very clear what's happening here. Now, you asked the question of, is there just enough room on the planet for people to live? So as it turns out, I give you the short answer. I mean, the short answer is that if God could resurrect the dead, as he promises he will, of the faithful, in Isaiah 26, verse 19, that's going to be quite a miracle. Finding enough room on this planet would be, in the scheme of things, a really a minor miracle, don't you think? Moreover, there are many countries that are really quite underpopulated. And even if you take countries, large countries like the United States, the third largest country in the world, where are people living? Let's take the country you live in. You live in Canada, geographically the second largest country in the world. I think it's number two. Where in Canada does everyone live? Right near the United States. Almost nobody lives up in the north. In the United States, where are the large population concentrations? They're on the East Coast and the West Coast and the coasts, if you notice that. When you fly over the United States, in the middle of the whole thing, the concentration of there's plenty of room, is what I'm saying. Just people want a beachfront, or people want to live next to New York, or people want to be next to Los Angeles. But if you want to live in the middle of anywhere else, so there's really plenty of room. A country like Russia, which is the largest country in the world geographically, is highly underpopulated. But this answer I'm giving you is really is not the real. The real answer is that in the scheme of things, this will be a very minor miracle. It's resurrecting the dead. Can these bones live? That's the miracle that we look forward to. Now, the God who created the heavens and the earth, this will be a small matter. So there's plenty of room, and the resurrection of the dead is the great miracle. You know, your question kind of reminds me of people who have no faith, who are not religious, wonder, how did God get kangaroos to Noah's Ark? Like, how did he manage that? In the scheme of things, if you can create kangaroos, then just getting them to another continent would be a minor miracle in the scheme of things. A serpent speaking by every measure, is a minor feat compared to creating a serpent. So these really are not the tough challenges for God. We can see in hindsight, now that we're living in an epoch which is very likely close to the Messianic age, the events are unfolding around us. We could see that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Almighty, blessed be His holy name, has kept every promise that He made to the Bnei Israel, to the children of Israel in the world. We could see all these prophecies unfolding, and therefore we can rest assured that just as HaKadosh Baruch Hu has kept all the promises that He made, that He will keep all the promises that have yet to be fulfilled, and please God, we should witness them quickly in our time.
Indeed.
Thank you for your question.
Yeah.